Welcome to this class on James 5 1 through 6, the condemnation of the wealthy. This is the end of the body of the letter of James. What he started in chapter 2, verses 1 through 13, now culminates in James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. And when he started in 2, 1 through 13, he really is kind of addressing the problems of the Roman patronage system. And then at the end of the letter here, he addresses the problem of Roman land ownership during the Roman period. So he really comes full circle in this anti-Roman section here where he condemns wealthy landowners. And that's why you see the two pictures here. The gold is an important word in this section. It reminds us of chapter 2, verses 1 through 13 with the man with the gold rings. And here he brings up gold again. And I have that right beside Dr. King and Reverend Abernathy's button from the SELC and the PCLC back in '68 when he was doing, they were leading the Poor People's Campaign, which led to Dr. King's assassination on April 4th in 1968. As somewhat of an aside, this April 4th, will be the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's martyrdom. There's going to be an all-day event there at the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Motel. So I encourage everybody that can to come. It's called MLK 50. There's going to be a whole day's worth of events there that's going to be important for the world, really, but especially for our country. And it gives us a space to really focus on what matters and try to create something good in our society. So the juxtaposition of the Poor People's Campaign over against this stacks of gold, is important because I think this section of James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6 really embodies this juxtaposition. So let's read this section that brings the body of the letter to a close. James says, "Now listen, rich people, weep while you wail for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your wealth has rotted and your garments have become moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have rusted, and its rust will be evidence against you, and it will eat your flesh like fire because you have stored it for the last days. Behold the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, who has been defrauded by you, cries out, and the cry of the harvesters has reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You all live in luxury on the earth and live in self-indulgence. You fatten your hearts on the day of slaughter. You all have condemned and murdered the just one who did not oppose you." This is an outright condemnation. There's not one verse here is a verse that calls for repentance. There is no repentance called for here. This is utter condemnation, like it's too late. It is the only thing left now is for the wealthy to be condemned and to pay for their wrongdoing. So it's a pretty intense section. It's probably the most intense and condemnatory section in the entire letter. I think James chapter 4, verses 1 through 12 is probably the strongest section of the letter that deals with anti-hybridity, specifically Pauline hybridity. This right here is the most straightforward anti-Roman piece of the entire letter. So let's look at it verse by verse, starting here with now listen, rich people, weep while you wail for the miseries that are coming upon you. So the listen now is age nun. This is exactly the way James opens the section chapter 4, verse 13, with an age nun. Now listen. And there he's talking to traveling business people or itinerant ministers, people like Paul. It starts with the same exact words. Um, and so I think these two sections are linked closely together because of this. But in chapter 4, verses 13 through 17, there seems to be some room for repentance. He actually uses the word brothers there, so it looks like internal language. Here, that's just not the case at all, and we are dealing specifically with folks who are not within the community. I don't think so. The rich people, plusioi here, this is the final time the word plusioi, which translates as the rich or the wealthy, this is the final time they are discussed. You can he uses this term in chapter 1, verses 10 through 11, and chapter 2, 5 through 6. So he uses it in other areas, but this is kind of how he shuts it down. So the section in chapter 1, verses 10 through 11, this is kind of the table of contents part that prefigures what's coming into chapter 5 through 6 and chapter 5, 1 through 6. And so in both of these sections, these are both anti-Roman sections. So chapter 1, those verses set up the beginning and the end of the body of the letter by using the same terminology. So we know that the rich or the wealthy are going to be important to the letter. And as soon as we get into the body of the letter, we see their importance. And then the way James closes the letter, we see their importance again. The wealthy are the bad guys. In chapter 2, verse 1 through 13, James says, these are the ones who drag you to court. That's going to be a common theme in chapter 5 too, especially this section. They drag you to court. They blaspheme the name over you. And that kind of stuff. So the rich people aren't good in chapter 2, and here they're utterly condemned in chapter 5. Weep while you wail, klausata, and this is a real interesting word, alalazantes. Alalazantes there's a technical term for a word like this. And it's any word that actually sounds the way it's supposed to mean. So the alalazantes is supposed to sound like a wailing of sorts, like an uncontrollable agony. So this is one of the most emphatic denunciations of wealthy people in the New Testament. But check out these passages from the Gospels: Mark chapter 10, 25, Matthew chapter 19, 23 through 24, and then Luke. And you notice how many passages are in Luke: chapter 1, chapter 6, chapter 12, chapter 14, chapter 16, chapter 18, chapter 21. Luke says a lot about the wealthy, and Luke has quite a bit of a money ethic, both in the Gospel and in the Acts of the Apostles. He writes both of those. Pay attention to these verses. Go through your Bible and read them and see how these Gospels were written much later than James, but you can see the Jesus tradition that becomes the Gospel. You can already see it here in James. James is already working with it. The Revelation is probably the most outright voiceful letter that is anti-Roman, because it actually calls for Rome to be destroyed. And James doesn't really do that, but outside of the Revelation, this may be the largest condemnation of the wealthy or rich people in the New Testament. So the word wail here is weep and wail. Wail is used in the prophetic literature of the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So look at Hosea 7:14. Look at Amos chapter 8. Verse 3, and actually read Amos 8, I think it's chapter 8, 19 through 24. It's very, you'll hear that condemnation. And then Isaiah, there's a lot of passages in Isaiah. I'm just giving you a couple of them here. Look at this and see how these prophets call on Israel to wail for their miseries, right? Because they've done something wrong. So the way James is calling out the wealthy here is a very prophetic way of doing it. And for the miseries, this is the same word used in chapter 4, verses 9. And this is where James is really condemning this Pauline hybridity. So basically, if you kind of negotiate some of the Roman world, if you say, okay, I'm going to take this part of the Roman world, but not that part of the world, I'll become all things to all people. That's the kind of stuff that James utterly criticizes within the Jesus following movement. So, chapter 4:9, he's using the same word for miseries as he's using in this anti Roman stuff. So, chapter 5, verse 1 starts off, and you know this is going to be a doozy, right? The wealthy are not going to be in good shape here. As we move to verse 2, you'll see the continuing with the theme. So you have plusiois, or the wealthy or the rich, condemned in verse 1, but now it says your wealth, using the same word. Your wealth has rotted, and your garments have become moth-eaten. So wealth is plutos, ha plutos. So you can see that it's the same kind of stuff. So this general term, this is a general term to talk about wealth. So it's not a certain kind of wealth. It's just wealth in general. But you can see the reason I tried to write it out in Greek here. This is not in Greek. It's transliterated into English. But I want you to see the root in both of these terms. So the wealthy or the rich is hoi plusioi, and wealth is ha plutos. So it's the same word. And then has rotted. The tense of the verb indicates that the rot has already started and the ruin is imminent. In other words, your wealth has rotted, has begun to rot, and therefore, kind of the end of this wealth is near. So it's fairly apocalyptic, like, and this is not just It's not just talking about the end of the world, but this is kind of like very revolutionary. Your wealth is losing its power. You're losing your wealth. It's almost over. It's almost done. And then the moth-eaten is a real interesting word. Suth is moth. Brada is to eat, so moth-eaten, and it's pretty close to a passage in Matthew in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in chapter 6, verse 19 through 20. And then in Luke 12:33, it talks about treasure from heaven, or your treasure in heaven. And that's where a place where no moth or worm or thief can have any effect. So the treasure in heaven is resistant to moth, worm, and thief. And here you have a moth eating the wealth of the rich. So verse 2 is really interesting, and it does have some Jesus tradition in it already. But you can see how the condemnation comes, and a part of that condemnation is that your wealth is already fading. And then it moves into verse 3, where James says, and this verse is just full. So your gold and silver have rusted, and its rust will be evidence against you, and it will eat your flesh like fire, because you have stored it for the last day. So there's a lot to unpack here. First of all, gold and silver, chrysos, argyros. It's important to notice that gold and silver were exclusive currency of Rome. So other regions of Rome couldn't print local currency or strike local currency in silver and gold. That was super illegal. Is basically a threat against the Roman Empire, saying that you have the capacity to create silver and gold coinage. Well, local currency in Palestine was mostly copper and bronze, and by the use of chrysos and argyros, this reminds us of the opening section of the letter, with the man with the gold rings and the fine clothing. It's just really, it pulls us right back to that opening of the body of the letter. But here he says the gold and silver have rusted. But even ancient people knew that gold and silver don't rust, right? I mean, silver tarnishes, but it really doesn't rust. And this only heightens the condemnation. Not even their money's going to be saved. Gold and silver, uh, they will rust away. It will vanish. And it's rust. It's eos. This is the same word used earlier in chapter 3, verses 8, but it's translated there as poison. It's talking about like the tongue is a poison. So here you get eos again, and then it talks about the poison in 3:8, like the tongue being a poison. So here I told you then that you can translate it either as poison or rust. It certainly makes more sense to translate it rust here. It really wouldn't make sense talking about it as a poison. This is a really interesting thing, though. It says that its rust is evidenced against you. This is a return to courtroom language as an evidence. Like this is evidence submitted to a court with somebody being on trial. And this goes right back to the wealthy, the courtroom language in chapter 2, verse 6, where it says the wealthy drag believers into court. But the word here, evidence, martyrion, this is the same word for witness, martyr. Our word martyr comes from this word. So it's a powerful term in the New Testament, talking about bearing witness, witnessing against you. So this rust is the witness. It is the one bearing testimony. And this time it's the wealthy who are receiving the judgment, right? So before in chapter 2, and that when he was kind of talking about Rome there, it was basically these Roman or people who are in bed with Rome who are the ones who are taking you to court. Well, here it's just the opposite. It's like they have, this is the evidence. The rust of their gold and silver is the evidence that shows that they aren't doing what's right. So it's an important word and an important idea. So, and then it says, it's evidence against you, and it eats your flesh like fire. That is prophetic denunciation found throughout the prophetic literature: Isaiah, Amos, Malachi, Hosea. This is very intense language. And here it says you stored it for the last days. Look at Luke chapter 12, verse 19, in that parable of the rich fool. There, rich people understand their security in their wealth, which is a misplaced security. But also, again, look at Amos chapter 8, 19 through 24, where there's this kind of, it ends with, justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. But what comes before that is a pretty harsh criticism of how they're not taking care of the poor, basically. And so because they're not, God doesn't like their music, God doesn't like the way they worship, all that. So this gold and silver's rust and how that rust cries, becomes evidence against them for the last days. It's pretty intense language, eating their flesh like fire. And it continues that. Behold, it's even a more heightened sense now. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, who've been defrauded by you, cries out. The wages cry out. And the cry of the harvesters has reached the ears of the Lord Almighty, or the Lord of hosts, or the Lord of the armies. It just kind of depends on how you want to translate that. So let's talk about the wages of the laborers. I mean, here we are about to pass a tax bill in America that absolutely favors the wealthy over the poor. We still don't have a minimum wage. You can work 2.5 full-time jobs, which is, a 40-hour work week is a full-time job. So 2.5 full-time jobs is 100 hours a week. You can work 100 hours a week and still be working poor. That is a wage issue. And that's today in the United States of America. So this verse 4 is important, I think, and all you preachers, I mean, pay attention to this. This is a preach. the wages of the laborers. Um, this is the gold and the silver that is rotted, right? So the landowners have been withholding the wages from their laborers, and they've been withholding it, so they've been accumulating all this gold and silver that should have been paid to the laborers, the wages of the laborers, but they kept it, and that's what's rotted it, right? So it was the laborers' wages that were withheld. The word laborer here is really important because it's ergaton, and it's the same root as works, erga, which is an important theme throughout the letter, right? I mean, James in chapter 2, 14 through 26, he argues pretty vehemently that faith without works is dead. You've got to have works. You've got to do something. And here, this is the wages of the doers, the wages of the workers. So this is an incredibly important term for James here, and he's saying these people that are doing the right things, you've defrauded them. These are the folks who mowed your fields. Mow is actually I don't know a better way to harvest your fields. Mow is actually the cutting of the grain, harvesting. This is past tense too. So the laborers have already done the work. The harvest has already been taken in, but they have not been paid. And this indicates that these are wealthy landowners. It talks about of your fields. So the wealthy here are wealthy landowners. And Leviticus 19 is important in James. Leviticus 19:18 is what James quotes back in the early parts of chapter 2, verses 1 through 13, at the very beginning, when he's again criticizing the Roman patronage system. There he talks about the royal law, or the law of the kingdom is to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, that's Leviticus 19:18. Well, you back up just a couple of verses to 19:13, it specifically mentions the wages of the laborers. And also Malachi 3:5. So this is not just a 2,000-year-old problem. This goes all the way back to Leviticus. So it's almost like the wealthy have always exploited the laborers. The poor have always been exploited, and James is calling to it an end to it, and not just an end to it, but a condemnation of those who perpetuate it. Defrauded. This indicates deliberate fraud, not we forgot to pay you, not sorry, there was a glitch in our systems and we accounted for it wrongly. This is not accidental fraud. This is deliberate fraud. They deliberately held back the wages of the laborers. And it says it cries out. And this is throughout prophetic literature in the Old Testament. And this is what Israel did in order for God to hear them. It says they cried out to God, and God heard their prayer. This is a theme throughout the Hebrew Bible. And then here it says the cry of the harvesters. So the wages themselves are personified. The wages cry out. Just like the rust was personified in the last verse, the rust eats their flesh. Here the wages cry out, and now the harvesters themselves cry out with their wages. So the harvesters join the crying. And you look at Genesis chapter 4:10 and Exodus 2:23. Genesis 4, it talks about the blood of Abel cried out. And then in Exodus 2:23, this is the cries of the Israelites. This is when they cried out before God because of the slavery that they experienced in Egypt. So James is picking up on these themes throughout the Old Testament, and it really comes to Exodus is an important part of it. So the ears, it said that it reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. Kyrios Sabaoth, that's important. Kyrio is the Lord, and again, this evokes the Exodus story. But Sabaoth, it shows God's power to act as the leader of a heavenly army. So this is important, especially in relation to Roman military power, right? I mean, the Roman landowners, or even the Jewish landowners who are doing what Romans do, their practices are so corrupt. They are basically just like the Egyptians when the Hebrew people were slaves in Egypt. And the intensity is just the same now. And James is saying that the cries of the harvesters has finally reached the ears of the Lord Almighty, the Lord of heaven, the master of heaven, the master of the heavenly army. This is military language, and it would absolutely be seditious for any Roman authority to read this. They would absolutely think this was revolt, a call for revolt, because it is an utter condemnation of those who are wealthy. And it kind of piles on. So now it talks about the condemnation. He goes, "You all live in luxury on earth and live in self-indulgence. You fatten your hearts on the day of slaughter." So the luxury on earth, taste gaze here, it takes us all the way back to chapter 3, 13 through 18, which was it was kind of the central argument against the Roman Empire when it's talking about wisdom of the earth. So this luxury here is equal to worldly wisdom. The taste gaze, the earth, here is the same taste gaze in 3:13 through 18, where it says, "This is not wisdom from above, but earthly, demonic, and unspiritual." Well, the earthly word there in 3:13 through 18 is taste gaze. Here it says, you live in luxury on earth, the epitaste gaze. So it absolutely is supposed to remind us of chapter 3:13 through 18. But this, they've basically gotten their reward already. And then self-indulgence is another kind of reckless hedonism where you're just stealing from the poor and doing whatever in the world you want with it. You fatten your hearts. Heart is an important term in James. Go ahead and go back and look at where he uses it. Chapter 1:26, 3:14, 4:8, and 5:8. It's kind of the seat of not just emotions, but it's kind of like the heart is the metaphorical center of the human. And here these folks have fattened their hearts. They've squandered any kind of charity, and they've just done it for themselves, as if that was going to be something good. So the day of slaughter is a real pretty intense section, but again, it echoes this the imminent destruction of the wealthy. And again, it's pretty seditious here. I don't know how a Roman leader could read this and not find themselves squarely in the category of the bad guys here. There's just no way. And then James kind of brings it to close in a really interesting and kind of hard to translate passage, verse. You all have condemned and murdered the just one who did not oppose you. Now this is a little problematic, but let's look at it. So you all have condemned. It goes again. This goes right back to courtroom language, like 2:6. But whereas before in this section where the rust was bearing testimony against the wealthy, here it's kind of returned to the wealthy where they drag you to court. Well, the wealthy you all have condemned and murdered. Murder is a really interesting word. This is the same word in the Ten Commandments, "do not murder," that he also brought up in chapter 2, verse 11, in that first opening of the letter. So you've condemned, you've murdered the just one. Now, a lot of commentators try to figure out how this as the crucifixion of Jesus, but that's really, James would have said that if that's what he meant. Dikaion is just literally means the one who is right, the just one. And most likely this, in this context, refers to the laborers or the harvesters, not necessarily Jesus. In other words, the rich people have condemned and murdered the laborers. And that's what this passage is actually about. Laborers who didn't oppose them in the first place. So it kind of shows how heartless these wealthy landowners are. Now, Johnson does a little something different here. So pay attention to the way Johnson translates this. And I translated, who did not oppose you. I think this is talking about the laborers, harvesters. Um, Johnson does a little bit something else. He kind of ends with, does God not oppose you? He turns it into a question and kind of inserts God there. Read page 305. I think it's important. Read Johnson anyway, not just that one page, but there's a section devoted to this one section of this verse on page 305 in his commentary. Pay real close attention to that because it's important, and you'll see his argument. When it's all said and done, James 5 1 through 6 is an utter denunciation of wealthy people. It is an utter condemnation of wealthy people because of the way the wealthy exploit the laborers. They have defrauded them, they have condemned them, they have murdered the laborers, and the laborers have cried to God just like the Hebrew people did when they were enslaved in Egypt. And God has heard their cry. And because of that, their gold and silver is going to rust, and that rust will eat their flesh like fire. So this is a pretty serious passage and shows you how serious the early Jesus movement was about issues related to wealth and poverty. You look at, James is early. So what comes after James? All the Gospels come after James, and Luke and Acts have serious ethics when it comes down to money, right? If there were people who were selling all their stuff, but they didn't give everything to the community, and so God struck them dead, right? So Luke is really serious about money. Paul is always taking up an offering for the people in Jerusalem, so he's maybe serious about money too, right? This might be some of the reason why James and Paul always argue about stuff. But money is an important thing, and the way you use it is important to James. And James basically saying that wealthy people don't use it right, and because of that, God will consume them, and not in a good way. So that's how James. That is how James ends the body of his letter. He ends it with the most intense section in the entire letter that he writes. So um, take a look at this passage, read it very carefully. Go back to the commentary on Johnson, read that commentary, read my section of my book, and compare me and Johnson over against each other. But pay real close attention because this is one of your paper passages, and I hope this lecture can shed some light on it for you. If you have any questions, please send me an email. I'm wide open. Take care.